I moved into my new apartment a week ago. It's a small, one-bedroom unit on the fourth floor of an old building. The rent is cheap, probably because of the faint smell of mildew in the hallways and the creaking wooden floors. But it's quiet, and that's what I needed after the chaos of my last place. On my first night, I noticed something strange. My downstairs neighbor's lights flickered constantly. At first, I thought it might be faulty wiring, but when I glanced out the window, the streetlight seemed unaffected. Just his window, flashing intermittently. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. The next day, I saw him for the first time. He was standing in the hallway as I left for work, an older man in a faded gray cardigan. His face was pale, almost waxy, like a mannequin left in the sun too long. When I said hello, he didn't respond. He just stared, his watery eyes fixed on mine. I hurried past him, my nerves jangling. That night, the flickering light started again. But this time, there was something else. A muffled sound, like a low hum or chant, coming through the floor. It was faint but steady, almost rhythmic. I tried turning up the TV to drown it out, but no matter how loud the volume, I could still hear it, like it was burrowing into my brain. I slept fitfully, plagued by strange dreams of shadowy figures standing at the foot of my bed. By the third night, I was starting to feel unhinged. The chanting grew louder, and now it was accompanied by a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor below me. At one point, I banged on the floor with a broom, shouting for him to stop. The noises ceased for a moment, and then came 3 deliberate knocks from below. Slow, deliberate, almost mocking. I froze, my skin crawling. The next morning, I decided to confront him. When I knocked on his door, there was no answer. I tried again, louder this time, but the apartment was silent. I went to the building manager to complain, but when I mentioned my neighbor in 3B, he frowned. "There's no one living in 3B, he said. "It's been vacant for years." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I've seen him. He's there every night, and the lights. The manager cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Look, I don't know what you think you've seen, but no one has rented that unit in a long time. If you're hearing noises, maybe it's the pipes or something." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and left, my mind reeling. That night, I stayed up late, determined to catch the man in the act. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and sat by the window, watching his unit. Around 2 a.m., the flickering started again. This time, I noticed something else. Shadows moving across the room, like figures pacing back and forth. But the shapes weren't human. They were elongated, distorted, as if the light itself bent around them. I grabbed my phone and started filming, but the screen showed nothing but darkness. Frustrated, I put the phone down and decided to go downstairs myself. As I stepped into the hallway, the air felt colder than usual. My footsteps echoed off the cracked plaster walls as I descended the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor. The door to 3B was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of light spilling into the dim hallway. I hesitated, my pulse pounding in my ears, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, propelled me forward. I pushed the door open and was hit by a wave of stale, musty air. The apartment was in complete disarray. The wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing mold-streaked walls underneath. Furniture lay scattered and broken, as if a storm had torn through the place. In the center of the room was a chair, facing the window, with its back to me. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. I approached the chair cautiously, my every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. As I rounded it, I saw the man. He was sitting stiffly, his hands resting on the armrests, his head tilted slightly downward as if in prayer. His eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. The flickering light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging slightly, though there was no breeze. "Sir?" I whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The moment my fingers brushed his sweater, his head snapped up. His eyes, those pale, watery eyes, locked onto mine, and his mouth moved, forming words that I couldn't hear. It wasn't until I stepped back that I realized why. The room was utterly silent. No hum, no creak, not even the sound of my own breathing. It was as if the world had gone mute. Then, he stood. The motion was abrupt and unnatural, like a puppet being yanked upright by invisible strings. His mouth was still moving, but the words never came. I stumbled backward, knocking over a small table, and the noise broke the silence like a gunshot. Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to shift and grow, spilling out from the corners and pooling at his feet. I ran. I bolted out of the apartment and up the stairs, the sound of heavy footsteps chasing me. I slammed my door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I pressed my ear against the wood. The footsteps stopped outside, and then came the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate raps. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I backed away, my eyes fixed on the door, until my legs hit the edge of the couch and I collapsed onto it. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard it, a whisper, faint and raspy, coming from the other side of the door. "You shouldn't have come." The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was old, yellowed, and brittle, like something pulled from an antique book. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 4 words: "He's watching you now." I didn't stick around to find out what it meant. By noon, I had packed my belongings and was on the road, leaving the apartment, and whatever lived in 3B far behind. I still don't know what I saw that night, and part of me hopes I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the faint sound of flickering lights, and I wonder if he's found me again. I wasn't planning to go hiking that day. It had been raining for most of the week, and the trails were muddy and slick. But the storm finally broke on Saturday morning, leaving the air crisp and cool, and I couldn't resist the chance to stretch my legs. I grabbed my boots and headed out to the woods, a place I'd hiked dozens of times before without incident. The first part of the trail was uneventful. The familiar sounds of birds and rustling leaves surrounded me, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns. The mud made the hike slower than usual, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be outside after being cooped up all week. About an hour in, I decided to take a less traveled path that branched off from the main trail. I'd explored it a few times before, but it always gave me a weird feeling. It wasn't marked on the maps, and the forest there was denser, the trees gnarled and covered in moss. It was quiet too, unnaturally so. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of my boots on the wet ground. As I pushed further in, the air grew colder, and a faint fog began to roll in, clinging to the forest floor. I almost turned back, but then I saw it, a structure barely visible through the trees. It looked like an old cabin, its wooden walls warped and rotting. The roof was partially collapsed, and vines crawled up the sides, as if the forest were trying to reclaim it. I don't know what possessed me to approach it. Something about the cabin felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, but curiosity got the better of me. The door was slightly ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I stepped inside, the floor creaking under my weight. The air inside was damp and musty, thick with the smell of decay. The interior was mostly empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and a layer of dirt and leaves that had blown in over the years. But in the corner, partially hidden under a pile of debris, I saw something shiny. I crouched down and brushed away the dirt, revealing a metal box. It was heavy, about the size of a shoebox, and covered in strange, intricate carvings. The designs were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Spirals and symbols that seemed to shift and twist when I looked at them too long. I tried to open it, but the lid wouldn't budge. There was no lock, no hinges, just a seamless piece of metal. My fingers tingled as I held it, and a strange sensation washed over me, like static electricity, but deeper, almost inside my head. I should have left it there. I should have walked away, but instead, I took it with me. By the time I got back to my car, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I placed the box in the trunk, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease as I slammed it shut. The drive home was quiet, the box's presence in the back of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't ignore. Once I got home, I set it on the kitchen table and tried to open it again. I pried at the edges with a butter knife, tapped on it with a hammer, even tried heating it with a lighter. Nothing worked. The surface remained smooth and cold, the carvings almost seeming to glow faintly in the dim light of my kitchen. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were filled with strange images, dark forests, twisting symbols, and a voice, low and guttural, whispering words I couldn't understand. When I woke, the clock on my nightstand read 3:33 a.m., and I could swear I heard faint scratching sounds coming from the kitchen. I crept out of bed, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. The house was dark and silent, the air thick with a tension I couldn't explain. As I stepped into the kitchen, the scratching stopped. The box sat where I'd left it, but something was different. The carvings on its surface had changed. I flicked on the light and leaned in closer. The spirals and symbols were now jagged and chaotic, like they'd been slashed into the metal. And in the center, where the carvings had been smooth, was a single word etched deep into the surface. Open. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The box had no visible way to open it before, but now there was a faint seam running along the edge. My hands shook as I picked it up and pried at the seam with my fingers. It opened easily, almost too easily, and the lid fell to the table with a metallic clang. Inside was a single object, a small black stone, polished to a mirror-like sheen. It felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and when I held it up to the light, I could see faint red veins running through it, pulsing softly, like a heartbeat. The moment I touched it, the room went dark. The lights flickered and died, and the air grew cold, heavy, oppressive. A sound filled the space, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Shadows began to crawl along the walls, moving unnaturally, defying the faint light streaming in from the window. And then, I saw them. Figures, tall and gaunt, with eyes that burned like embers, emerged from the shadows. They didn't walk, they glided, silent and deliberate, their movements jerky and inhuman. They surrounded me, their empty faces fixed on the stone in my hand. One of them reached out, its long, bony fingers hovering inches from my face. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice inside my head, a whisper that reverberated like thunder. You took what was not yours. The stone grew hotter in my hand, searing my palm. I screamed and dropped it, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small room. The figures recoiled, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke as the stone hit the ground. When the lights came back on, the stone was gone, and the box was empty. But the carvings on the lid had changed again. Now they formed a single, clear message. It's yours now. I left the house that night, taking nothing but my car keys and wallet. I don't know what happened to the box, or the stone, or the things that came with it. I've been too afraid to go back, and I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a dark room, I still feel them watching me, waiting. Mrs. Lacey's tabby had gone missing about a week ago. She'd put up posters all over the neighborhood, bright yellow flyers with a blurry photo of Mittens and a reward offer scrawled in shaky handwriting. People lose pets all the time, so no one thought much of it. But when Mr. Alvarez's dog vanished 2 days later, people started talking. By the time the Thompsons' teenage son didn't come home from school, the entire neighborhood was on edge. I'd lived in this cul-de-sac for 5 years, long enough to know all my neighbors. We weren't particularly close, but we exchanged pleasantries, lent each other sugar, the usual suburban camaraderie. So when the neighborhood watch organized a meeting to discuss the disappearances, I figured it wouldn't hurt to go. The meeting was held in the Thompsons' garage. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and everyone spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid someone might overhear. Theories were thrown around. Wild animals, kidnappers, even a satanic cult. But no one had any answers, just a growing sense of dread. I stayed quiet for most of it, until Mrs. Lacey turned to me. "You're up late sometimes, aren't you?" she asked. "You ever see anything strange?" I hesitated. I did stay up late, often working on my laptop in the living room with the blinds open. And now that she mentioned it, I had seen something a few nights ago. A shadow moving through the backyard, too large to be a cat or dog. But I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I shrugged it off. Probably just a deer. I said. Nothing unusual. The meeting ended without any resolution, and people drifted back to their homes. But as I walked down the street toward my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. That night, I stayed up later than usual, my laptop forgotten as I kept glancing out the window. Around 2 a.m., I saw it again, the shadow. It moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trees at the edge of my yard. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was cold and still. I scanned the yard, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself I was imagining things and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, another flyer appeared on a telephone pole. This time, it was for Mr. Alvarez. The flyer had a grainy photo of Mr. Alvarez and a plea from his wife. "Please, if anyone has seen him, call this number." A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just pets anymore. People were disappearing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the yard, the street, the line of trees that marked the edge of the neighborhood. Hours passed in silence. My only companions the faint hum of the streetlights and the occasional creak of the house settling. Then, around 3 a.m., I saw it again. The shadow, but this time, it wasn't in my yard. It was standing in the middle of the street, perfectly still. My mouth went dry as I stared at it, trying to make out its shape. It wasn't human, not entirely. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an odd angle. The streetlights flickered as it began to move, slow and deliberate, toward the Thompsons' house. I don't know what came over me, but I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. The air was icy, biting against my skin as I crept toward the street, my footsteps eerily loud in the stillness. I raised my phone, trying to snap a picture, but the camera wouldn't focus. The shadow seemed to ripple and blur, like smoke caught in a draft. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. The thing stopped and turned toward me. For a moment, the world felt like it had stopped too. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Then it turned and vanished into the trees. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial the police. When they arrived, there was no sign of anything unusual, no tracks in the yard, no disturbed leaves, nothing to prove I hadn't just imagined it. Over the next few days, more people disappeared. The Thompsons packed up and left, their house sitting empty with a "for sale" sign planted in the yard. The neighborhood grew quieter, more desolate, as families moved away, too afraid to stay. I started sleeping with the lights on, every door and window locked, but it didn't help. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear scratching at the walls, faint whispers that seemed to come from the vents. I stopped going outside after dark, but sometimes I'd catch glimpses of the shadow through the blinds, moving slowly, methodically, as if searching for something or someone. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door open. I was certain I'd locked it. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the room. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the silence before a storm. And then, from the corner of the room, I heard it, a low, guttural voice. "Come with me." I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body was frozen, my throat tight as I stared into the darkness. The shadow stepped forward, its form barely distinguishable from the blackness of the room. I closed my eyes, praying it would go away, and when I opened them again, it was gone. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and I didn't look back. I've been living out of motels ever since, moving from place to place, never staying too long. But no matter how far I go, I can still feel it watching me, waiting. If you like this stories, please support us by liking and subscribing. It helps me find more creepy stories for you. I've always been a quiet neighbor. I keep to myself, don't throw parties, and never let my music get too loud. That's why moving into this apartment complex felt like a good fit. Everyone here seemed just as reserved as I was, except for the guy in 2C. The first time I saw him, I was unloading boxes from my car. He was standing on his balcony, leaning on the railing and watching me. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the building, but I could tell he was tall, wiry, with a head of messy, dark hair. When I glanced up and waved, he didn't respond, just kept staring until I finally looked away, uncomfortable. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. Footsteps pacing back and forth in the middle of the night. Odd smells wafting from his unit. A sharp metallic tang that made my nose sting. Once, I heard a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the walls with their knuckles. It seemed to come from his apartment, but when I pressed my ear against the wall to listen, it stopped. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd lived next to strange neighbors before. But then, the packages started showing up. At first, it was just a couple of boxes piled outside his door. Big ones, unmarked, with no shipping labels or return addresses. Over the next week, more arrived, until the hallway outside 2C was crowded with them. None of them ever moved, though. I never saw him bring them inside, and the pile just kept growing. One night, I came home late from work and nearly tripped over a box that had been left in front of my door. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note, no indication of who it was for, but when I picked it up, I could feel something heavy shifting inside. I knocked on 2C's door, figuring he'd left it there by mistake. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but the apartment was silent. Finally, I set the box down and went inside my own place, locking the door behind me. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box. Inside was a single, heavy object wrapped in layers of crumpled newspaper. When I unwrapped it, I found a strange metal figurine, a crude, hand-carved thing that looked like some kind of twisted animal. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in sharp points, and its face was a grotesque, snarling snout. I didn't recognize the style or material, but just holding it made my skin crawl. I put it back in the box and shoved it under my bed, telling myself I'd figure out what to do with it later. That night, I dreamed of dark, empty hallways and the sound of claws clicking against the floor. I've always been a quiet neighbor. I keep to myself, don't throw parties, and never let my music get too loud. That's why moving into this apartment complex felt like a good fit. Everyone here seemed just as reserved as I was, except for the guy in 2C. The first time I saw him, I was unloading boxes from my car. He was standing on his balcony, leaning on the railing and watching me. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of the building, but I could tell he was tall, wiry, with a head of messy, dark hair. When I glanced up and waved, he didn't respond, just kept staring until I finally looked away, uncomfortable. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. Footsteps pacing back and forth in the middle of the night. Odd smells wafting from his unit. A sharp metallic tang that made my nose sting. Once, I heard a faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on the walls with their knuckles. It seemed to come from his apartment, but when I pressed my ear against the wall to listen, it stopped. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I'd lived next to strange neighbors before. But then, the packages started showing up. At first, it was just a couple of boxes piled outside his door. Big ones, unmarked, with no shipping labels or return addresses. Over the next week, more arrived, until the hallway outside 2C was crowded with them. None of them ever moved, though. I never saw him bring them inside, and the pile just kept growing. One night, I came home late from work and nearly tripped over a box that had been left in front of my door. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, wrapped in plain brown paper. There was no note, no indication of who it was for, but when I picked it up, I could feel something heavy shifting inside. I knocked on 2C's door, figuring he'd left it there by mistake. No answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but the apartment was silent. Finally, I set the box down and went inside my own place, locking the door behind me. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box. Inside was a single, heavy object wrapped in layers of crumpled newspaper. When I unwrapped it, I found a strange metal figurine, a crude, hand-carved thing that looked like some kind of twisted animal. Its limbs were long and thin, ending in sharp points, and its face was a grotesque, snarling snout. I didn't recognize the style or material, but just holding it made my skin crawl. I put it back in the box and shoved it under my bed, telling myself I'd figure out what to do with it later. That night, I dreamed of dark, empty hallways and the sound of claws clicking against the floor. I always loved running at night. There was something peaceful about it. The empty streets, the cool air, the way the world seemed to quiet down when the sun disappeared. My usual route took me through my suburban neighborhood, past the park, and into a wooded trail that looped back around to my house. It was safe, or so I thought. That night started like any other. I laced up my sneakers, slipped on a hoodie, and headed out around 9 p.m. The first part of my run was uneventful. The occasional car passed by, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement, but otherwise, the streets were deserted. When I reached the trailhead, the air seemed heavier somehow, the usual chirping of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by an eerie stillness. I brushed it off as my imagination and pressed on, my shoes crunching against the gravel path. About 10 minutes in, I noticed something odd. The light from my headlamp seemed dimmer than usual, barely cutting through the darkness. I stopped to adjust it, tapping the side to see if the batteries were dying. As I fiddled with it, I heard a sound, a faint rustling coming from the woods to my right. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, but my heart was already racing. I shone the beam of my headlamp into the trees, searching for movement, but all I saw was the dense wall of branches and leaves. The sound stopped, and I forced myself to keep going, telling myself I was being paranoid. A few minutes later, I heard it again, louder this time, closer. I turned, sweeping the light across the woods, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, an outline, a figure crouched low among the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, willing it to move, to prove me wrong. But nothing happened. The woods were still. "Get a grip," I whispered, shaking my head. I picked up my pace, the steady rhythm of my footsteps echoing in the quiet. But now I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle, every crunch of leaves, felt deliberate, like someone, or something, was mirroring my movements. I finally reached the halfway point of the trail, the part where the path curves sharply and loops back toward the entrance. There's a small clearing there, just a patch of grass surrounded by trees. But as I approached, my headlamp flickered and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I stopped, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight. My fingers were shaking, and it took longer than it should have to unlock the screen. When I finally turned on the light, I saw it. In the middle of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its arms hung at strange angles, like a marionette with broken strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale, almost luminous skin. I froze, unable to look away as it began to move, stepping forward with a jerky, uncoordinated gait. The closer it got, the more I noticed the strange, wet sound it made with each step, like flesh slapping against wet pavement. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my chest tight as if the air had been sucked out of my lungs. The thing advanced slowly, methodically, and with each step, a low, guttural sound began to emanate from its throat. It wasn't a growl or a moan, more like a deep vibration, almost animalistic but far too deliberate. Finally, my instincts kicked in. I turned and ran, my phone light bouncing wildly in the darkness. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the sound of my own breathing and the thudding of my shoes on the trail. But behind me, I could hear it following, the wet slap of its steps growing louder, faster. I veered off the trail, plunging into the trees. Branches whipped against my face and arms as I pushed through the dense undergrowth, hoping to lose it in the tangle of woods. My phone slipped from my hand. The light snuffed out as it hit the ground. I didn't stop to retrieve it. The dark was oppressive, the trees closing in around me like the walls of a maze. I stumbled over roots, my hands scraping against rough bark as I tried to steady myself. The sound of its pursuit was relentless, now accompanied by that deep, vibrating hum that seemed to fill the air. making it harder to think, harder to breathe. Somehow, I found my way back to the main trail. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare slow down. The entrance wasn't far now, just a few more bends in the path. I told myself I could make it if I just kept running. But then, it appeared ahead of me. It stepped onto the trail as if it had been waiting, its head tilting to one side in an almost curious gesture. My momentum carried me forward, too fast to stop completely, and I skidded to a halt just feet away from it. Up close, its featureless face was even more horrifying, its surface shifting and rippling like liquid. The vibrating sound intensified, rattling through my skull, and I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. I don't know how long I stayed there, paralyzed by fear and the overwhelming noise. It felt like an eternity, but it could have been seconds. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I opened my eyes, and it was gone. The woods were silent again, eerily so, as if the world had been muted. I staggered to my feet and ran the rest of the way to the trailhead, my vision blurring with tears. When I burst out onto the street, I collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for air and looking over my shoulder to make sure it wasn't following me. It wasn't. I don't remember much about how I got home. My mind was a haze of panic and exhaustion. I locked every door and window, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall, staring at the front door until morning. I haven't gone running since. I told myself it was just a trick of the dark, my mind playing games with shadows and sounds. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that low, vibrating hum in the distance, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting.